So what were some of the early leadership lessons that, have stuck with you that made a big impact that are still influencing how you lead today?
I think the biggest lesson that I've learned, when thinking back to the people that I've worked for, so I've worked for great leaders and I've worked for, average leaders, and I've worked for leaders that I think were maybe a little bit below average. And the one consistent thing I've seen in great leaders is they're somewhat selfless in how they approach their leadership. So one of the best leaders I ever had was the division president at Pulte when I went there. And you could really sense that he cared about his people and he was very consistent in his actions so that you could rely upon what he was going to do. You knew he was going to do the right thing. You saw him doing the right thing. You saw him seeing and acting in a consistent way. So you could see really, he began to create that trust. And I think from my perspective, trust is the most important part of leadership, because if people don't trust you, they're not going to follow you. And versus people who I saw early in my career who acted in one way or said one thing and then acted in a different way, right? And immediately you start to lose trust in that person. You're saying, well, if they'll do that with someone else, if they'll treat a vendor or a partner that way, then what's to stop them from treating me that way? And so I really think that I try and instill that in my leadership style, is that people know that I'm going to say and do the same things, right? Have integrity in my actions and also behave in a way that they can be proud of, right? If you're doing underhanded things or they see you mistreating people, then they're going to, that reflects on how you're going to treat them. And so I think that's just kind of important skill or important leadership trait to have.
So then when you moved into, so it's an interesting journey, right? We go smaller, bigger, and then big, really big, and then to one, and then to one, right? And then it was just you. And then it moved up to 65. So when you then went from 30,000 to one, okay, and then you started to be part of this growing, building, exciting business, what were some things you learned in that regard? I mean, I bet that was a challenging time because, when you're we think of startup and entrepreneurial leadership, I mean, you got to wear a lot of hats in the beginning. I mean, you're kind of every function, and when it's just you, and then over time, you peel some of those off. You get some talented folks around you. But what were some things you learned in the early years of Next Metro?
Yeah, it was funny. We said that, I'd work on projects all day, and then I would have to do the dishes before I went home at night, right? Because there was no one else to do the dishes
right.
In the lunchroom, right? So you kind of wear all the hats and do all the things. One of the things that stands out to me is as we grew, we would hire subject matter experts, right? And bring them in, but we'd make them wear multiple different hats, or I would make them wear multiple different hats. And what I found was as we got bigger, those folks would start to struggle because they're trying to manage too broad of an area of the business. And they were really subject matter experts. And then we would bring in someone who was an expert in an area that they were not as strong in, but we saw ourselves lagging. And that part of our business would just take off and it would become so much stronger. And so one lesson was making sure that you're paying attention to if people have gotten over their skis in their role, and then bring in, not criticizing them for that because they're just wearing too many hats, right? Bring in someone who can take the burden of the area where they have weakness, or just aren't as strong. I should say weakness, just aren't as strong. That takes that off. And then both that new person and the person who is struggling start to flourish, right? And so that's something I kind of try to continue to do through the organization. But I think that the big lesson in coming from a big company to what we did at Next Metro is it's just different being a leader when you're an owner of the company, right? Versus being in a large organization like Pulte, where in some regards, your role as a leader is to just get to the next level of leadership, right? You're kind of, there's politics and there's moves you're trying to make just for the purpose of moving up in the organization. Versus when you're the leader of a company that you're an owner in, you're really thinking more like an owner. and in all facets, like what is best for the company. Whereas I think sometimes that gets lost in larger companies where you're trying to work your way up that leadership train. And so it more aligns you with, obviously, with the business, which is just a different leadership mentality, right? You're just more conscious of what is good for the business versus what is good for me.